January 1944. The Atlantic winds whip against the steel hull of a transport ship cutting through icy waters. On deck, a cluster of German prisoners of war huddle in threadbare coats, their eyes scanning the distant horizon. The sky above is a slate gray, the kind that makes the ocean seem endless, swallowing everything in its path. Every creak of the ship's timbers, every roar of the engine, is a reminder that they are far from home, far from the battlefields they once knew. As dawn breaks, the coastline of the United States appears. Smokestacks punctuate the skyline, belching plumes of black smoke into the morning air. Below, sprawling complexes of factories stretch for miles, their assembly lines humming in unison. The prisoners gaze in disbelief, mouths slightly agape, hearts beating with a mix of fear and awe. Trucks and trains crisscross the roads, moving with relentless efficiency, carrying raw materials, finished goods, and armored vehicles. For these men, hardened by years of war in Europe and North Africa, nothing could have prepared them for this sight. America's industrial engine roared not just with power, but with the promise of an unstoppable war machine. The moment would forever redefine their understanding of the world beyond the front lines, and the war they thought they knew. By 1943, the tide of the Second World War had shifted. The Axis powers, once seemingly invincible, were beginning to falter on multiple fronts. German forces were stretched thin, fighting a relentless series of battles across Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. The German army, the Wehrmacht, had achieved early victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, but the momentum had slowed. The Allies, particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, were beginning to exploit the cracks in German strategy, leveraging superior resources, manpower, and increasingly, industrial power. As battles raged from the sands of Tunisia to the snows of Stalingrad, tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured. In North Africa, the surrender at El Alamein and later at Tunis left large numbers of German and Italian troops in Allied hands. On the Eastern Front, entire divisions were encircled by Soviet advances. Across Europe, every failed offensive produced prisoners who required careful management. The Allies faced a logistical challenge: what to do with tens of thousands of enemy soldiers far from the front lines, often in regions ill-equipped to house them indefinitely. The United States, though geographically distant from the primary theaters of war, had become a crucial hub in this operation. Its industrial capacity was unmatched, and its infrastructure, from railroads to ports, allowed it to move vast numbers of men and material efficiently. The U.S. military saw an opportunity. Not only could these POWs be contained safely, but they could also contribute to the war effort in non-combat roles, alleviating labor shortages in farms, factories, and public works. Transporting prisoners across the Atlantic was no small feat. Specialized ships were requisitioned, designed to carry hundreds of men in relative security. Decks were modified for confinement, and armed guards ensured order during the voyage. For the prisoners themselves, the journey was surreal. Many had fought in the fiercest battles of the European and African campaigns, yet now found themselves under strict supervision, confined in foreign waters, moving toward a country most had only heard about in propaganda or rumor. The industrial landscape awaiting them was unlike anything they had seen at home. German soldiers had grown accustomed to factories that, while efficient, were constrained by the war. Cities like Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg had been under constant threat of bombing. Resources were rationed. Labor was directed, but often fragmented by shortages of raw materials and skilled workers. In contrast, the United States had mobilized its economy on a scale previously unseen in human history. Entire cities had been transformed into industrial hubs. In Detroit, the so-called arsenal of democracy, automobile factories had been converted into tank, truck, and aircraft production lines. Steel mills in Pittsburgh and Cleveland ran day and night, producing the backbone of the American war machine. For German POWs, arriving in the U.S. meant stepping into a world defined by speed, scale, and precision. The railroads moved in near-perfect coordination with ports and factories. Ships unloaded tons of raw materials daily. Cranes lifted massive steel girders while assembly lines turned out thousands of vehicles a week. The efficiency was almost mechanical, yet deeply human. The work of ordinary Americans, women and men, working in unison toward a single goal. Beyond the physical scale, there was the psychological impact. POWs who had faced the horrors of war were suddenly confronted with an industrial empire operating in peacetime rhythm, albeit for wartime production. The contrast was stark. Their lives in Europe had been dominated by survival, scarcity, and constant threat. Here, machinery, logistics, and manpower combined to create a sense of invincibility that was both intimidating and awe-inspiring. This was the world into which they were delivered, a world that would challenge every assumption about the enemy, the war, and even the limits of human organization. It was a revelation that went beyond fear. It was an education in industrial power, in the logistical and technological superiority that would ultimately help determine the outcome of the conflict. Upon arrival in the United States, German prisoners were met with a landscape both alien and intimidating. Ports like New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans were bustling with wartime activity. Soldiers and dockworkers moved in precise coordination, unloading cargo, organizing shipments, and ensuring the smooth transfer of thousands of POWs from ship to train. For men who had spent years on the battlefields of Europe and North Africa, the scale of organization was overwhelming. The cities themselves seemed alive with machinery. Smoke and steam rose from factories, trains rattled along iron tracks, and the hum of engines filled the air. From the docks, POWs were transported inland to camps scattered across the country. The U.S. Army established more than 500 camps, from the swamps of Florida to the plains of Kansas, designed to house tens of thousands of prisoners. Each camp was self-contained, with barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, and recreation areas. The design reflected American military efficiency. No detail was overlooked. Guards were stationed strategically, but prisoners quickly realized that while security was strict, the Americans were careful to maintain humane conditions. Many POWs would later recall the clean living quarters, regular meals, and medical care as surprisingly generous compared to what they had endured during the war. Work assignments became an integral part of life in the camps. The U.S. government, faced with labor shortages due to the deployment of millions of men overseas, utilized POW labor for agriculture, forestry, and light industrial work. In the fields, prisoners planted crops that would feed both soldiers and civilians. In factories and warehouses, they assisted in production and logistics, though never in direct combat manufacturing. For the Germans, this work was a mixture of relief and disorientation. Relief, that they were alive and relatively safe, disorientation at being part of an American workforce that dwarfed anything they had ever known. It was not only the scale of labor, but also the machinery that left a lasting impression. American factories were sprawling complexes, often spanning multiple city blocks, with assembly lines that moved with mechanical precision. Huge presses shaped steel for tanks, massive lathes and mills carved engine parts, and rows of welders worked in near-perfect unison. The prisoners had experienced factories in Germany, of course, but these were smaller, constrained by resources, frequently disrupted by Allied bombings and limited by the wartime economy. Here, in the heart of the United States, production never stopped. The sheer volume of output was staggering. Cultural contrasts added another layer to the POW's shock. In Europe, the population had been living under constant strain, rationing, shortages, and the ever-present threat of air raids. In contrast, the Americans they observed were vibrant, confident, and unyielding in their pursuit of production. Women worked in factories in unprecedented numbers, running machines and managing logistics with skill and authority. Civilians moved with purpose. their energy reinforcing the POWs' growing awareness that they were witnessing something far beyond the confines of a typical war economy. Communication between prisoners and guards often revealed both misunderstandings and surprising humanity. Some POWs attempted to convey skepticism about the U.S. war effort, expecting hostility or derision, but found their American overseers polite, sometimes even conversational. Letters sent back to Germany, sometimes censored and often embellished, carried tales of factories, machinery, and the almost unbelievable scale of American production. These accounts would reach home and gradually reshape German perceptions of the enemy. Perhaps most importantly, the prisoners began to internalize a fundamental truth. They were not merely being held captive, they were witnesses to an industrial might that was transforming the world. The United States, once distant and abstract in their minds, had become tangible, overwhelming, and unstoppable. This realization would color their experiences for the duration of the war, and in many ways define their memories of the conflict itself. As the POWs settled into camp life, a mixture of curiosity, awe, and unease settled over them. They were learning in real time what Germany had been fighting against, a nation whose industrial machinery, logistical coordination, and societal mobilization would prove decisive. Every factory they saw, every train that carried supplies across hundreds of miles, reinforced the scale of the challenge facing the Axis powers. For these men, the war they had known in Europe now had a new dimension, one of industry, efficiency, and human ingenuity operating on an unprecedented scale. This sets the stage for a deeper exploration of perspective, showing how POWs experienced the war from within the heart of American industrial power. For the German POWs, the first encounters with America's industrial machinery were deeply personal experiences. Men who had endured the trenches, desert campaigns, and the relentless front lines of Europe found themselves standing before vast factories, long assembly lines, and endless columns of vehicles. The reactions were complex: awe, disbelief, and a sense of inferiority. In letters and later memoirs, prisoners described their first sight of Detroit's automotive plants converted for war production as something out of a dream. Enormous halls filled with machines, conveyor belts moving in perfect rhythm, and men and women working with an almost mechanical efficiency. The scale was not just impressive, it was intimidating. Many POWs later admitted that for the first time, they understood the true power of the United States, not just in terms of military might, but in its ability to organize, produce, and sustain the war effort on an industrial scale far beyond anything in Europe. From a tactical perspective, the presence of POWs in the U.S. served multiple purposes. Beyond humanitarian obligations under the Geneva Convention, these prisoners contributed to the domestic war effort. The U.S. Army assigned them to non-combat work, alleviating labor shortages in agriculture, forestry, and light industry. POWs worked on farms planting crops, harvesting fields, and maintaining equipment. In warehouses and factories, they assisted in tasks that did not involve the creation of weapons or combat vehicles, but were essential to logistics and supply chains. This labor freed American men to serve at the front lines, demonstrating a tactical use of prisoners that combined compliance with international law and practical resource management. For the POWs, performing these tasks further exposed them to the scale and efficiency of American society, deepening their awareness of a nation mobilized to an unprecedented degree. Technology was perhaps the most visually striking element for the German prisoners. In Europe, many factories had been disrupted by Allied bombing, and wartime shortages had limited machinery, spare parts, and production speed. In the U.S., POWs saw industrial technology at its peak. Massive stamping presses shaped steel with precision. Assembly lines produced tanks, trucks, and aircraft at remarkable speed, and rail systems coordinated deliveries across vast distances. The prisoners observed workers operating cranes capable of lifting tens of tons, automated conveyor belts moving components seamlessly, and cutting-edge engines being assembled at astonishing rates. Even those who had been engineers or mechanics in Germany were taken aback by the scale, speed, and reliability of these machines. The combination of human labor and technology created an almost hypnotic rhythm, a visible testament to America's industrial superiority. The psychological impact on POWs was profound. Many had entered captivity expecting confinement and perhaps isolation, but instead, they found themselves surrounded by evidence of a nation capable of sustaining war indefinitely. Letters sent home often reflected disbelief. Men described factories larger than entire towns, trains stretching beyond the horizon, and production lines that seemed unending. The effect was both humbling and disorienting. Soldiers who had once believed in Germany's invincibility were forced to confront a reality where the enemy's capacity for production dwarfed their own experiences at the front. This cognitive dissonance, the clash between preconceptions and reality, shaped prisoners' attitudes toward the war, their captors, and their own nation's prospects. American military leadership played a critical role in shaping the POW experience. Generals and camp commanders understood that humane treatment and efficient organization were not just moral imperatives, but strategic necessities. Camps were carefully planned to maximize security while minimizing unrest, with clear hierarchies among both staff and prisoners. Officers were tasked with maintaining order, but also with ensuring that prisoners were fed, housed, and occupied. These leadership decisions reflected an understanding that a content, engaged POW population was less likely to resist or cause disorder. Moreover, leaders recognized that showcasing American industrial efficiency to the prisoners served a psychological purpose. It demonstrated the organizational superiority of the United States, indirectly reinforcing the futility of continued resistance. The POW's growing respect, or at least acknowledgement of American competence, was a quiet but powerful victory for U.S. military leadership. From the German perspective, reports from returning soldiers or intercepted communications often underestimated American capabilities. Many POWs carried these misconceptions with them when they arrived. The enemy assumed the U.S., though abundant in resources, would be slow, disorganized, and inefficient in mobilizing for total war. The reality, however, shattered these assumptions. Prisoners quickly realized that the United States had perfected industrial coordination on a scale unimaginable to most Germans. Entire cities functioned as integrated production hubs, with materials, labor, and transport synchronized with precision. For those who had once served as officers or engineers, the realization was particularly jarring. The logistical and industrial intelligence they had relied upon in Europe was outdated, incomplete, or simply irrelevant in the face of American ingenuity. The moral dimension of the POW experience also deserves attention. Unlike many wartime detentions in Europe, American camps prioritized humane treatment, medical care, and regulated labor practices. Prisoners were not exploited in combat production, but contributed meaningfully to agriculture and infrastructure. This approach aligned with the Geneva Convention and reflected a broader ethical stance. Even in war, humanity had limits. For the POWs, the treatment they received was a stark contrast to their experiences on the front lines, where harsh conditions, hunger, and fear of death were daily constants. Some prisoners expressed admiration for the fairness and organization, even as they continued to grapple with the underlying reality. They were captives in an industrial powerhouse. Cultural shocks compounded the prisoners' astonishment. Beyond machines and production lines, they encountered a society unlike anything in Europe. Women worked alongside men in factories, performing skilled labor at a level previously reserved for men in German industry. Civilians interacted confidently and openly, often treating POWs with civility and at times curiosity. The prisoners' interactions with Americans, whether in camp or on work assignments, exposed them to democratic norms, social freedoms, and a level of civilian engagement absent in wartime Europe. These experiences contributed to a subtle, yet profound, shift in perception. The enemy was not a monolithic force of faceless civilians, but a nation of industrious, disciplined, and remarkably capable individuals. Spring 1944. German POWs were transported from the ports to the heart of American industry. For many, the first sight of sprawling factory complexes was unforgettable. In Detroit, the so-called arsenal of democracy, entire city blocks were converted into war production centers. Smokestacks belched constant plumes of smoke, punctuating the rhythmic roar of machinery. Assembly lines stretched like veins through massive halls, transporting steel, engines, and vehicles at a pace that left the prisoners' European experiences pale in comparison. The initial reaction was stunned silence. Men accustomed to the decimated factories of wartime Germany found themselves surrounded by perfection in motion. Tanks rolled off assembly lines with near-clockwork precision, aircraft fuselages glided down conveyors, and trucks lined up in endless sequences, ready to be deployed overseas. Every movement, every turn of a machine seemed synchronized to a singular purpose: relentless production. Some prisoners were assigned to auxiliary work within these complexes. Though barred from assembling weapons directly, they maintained machinery, handled raw materials, or performed logistical support. Each task brought them closer to witnessing the efficiency and scale of American manufacturing firsthand. A single assembly line could produce dozens of trucks daily, a rate impossible in Europe at the time. The POWs marveled not only at the machines, but at the humans operating them. Skilled laborers moving with precision, energy, and focus, often in shifts that kept operations running 24 hours a day. Letters sent back to Germany, smuggled or censored, reveal the psychological impact of these experiences. One soldier described Detroit's factories as cities of steel and fire, where men and machines breathe as one. Another recalled the ceaseless rhythm of production, an unstoppable river of vehicles, tanks, and planes, moving with terrifying efficiency. The men could not reconcile this with the propaganda they had been fed about American weakness or inefficiency. The realization was inescapable. They were confronting an enemy whose industrial might was not just formidable, but overwhelming. The impact extended beyond the machinery. POWs were transported by trains to steel mills in Pittsburgh and found themselves dwarfed by the furnaces and presses. Hot molten steel poured continuously into molds, forming the frames and engines that would eventually reach distant battlefields. Here, the prisoners began to understand the logistical genius behind the American war effort. Railroads, ports, and factories operated in seamless coordination, ensuring that raw materials flowed continuously into production lines. Finished goods reached shipping centers, and every cog in the system functioned with near-perfect timing. Even routine tasks underscored the scale of U.S. industry. In agricultural labor assignments, prisoners harvested crops that fed soldiers and civilians alike. Fields stretched for miles, maintained with tractors and machinery that outclassed European counterparts. Factories, rail yards, and farms each revealed a single truth: the American war effort was sustained not by chance, but by deliberate organization and a depth of resources that the prisoners could scarcely imagine. In addition, the prisoners began to observe the social dimension of this industrial machine. Women, young and old, moved confidently along factory floors, skilled and empowered. Men of varying ages and backgrounds coordinated complex tasks with minimal supervision. Civilians appeared almost unshakable in their confidence. This was not just industrial might. It was a societal commitment to war production, a level of mobilization that left the POWs grappling with both awe and apprehension. The turning point in perception occurred when prisoners traveled to shipyards along the East Coast. There, Liberty ships, colossal cargo vessels, were constructed at rates previously thought impossible. Some ships took as little as a few weeks from keel laying to launch. The POWs watched steel plates welded, hulls assembled, and cranes lifting massive components with an efficiency that bordered on the surreal. Soldiers who had fought and lost ground in North Africa or the Eastern Front began to internalize a sobering truth. America's capacity to sustain and equip a war of global scale was nearly limitless. It was not fear alone that gripped them. It was a mixture of respect, disbelief, and quiet resignation. These men, once proud of their own nation's achievements, confronted a reality they could not deny. The United States had transformed industrial ability into a weapon of war, and the prisoners stood as witnesses to its full power. Every factory, every assembly line, every synchronized movement of machine and man reinforced the inevitability of American supremacy in production, a supremacy that would shape the war's outcome far beyond the battlefield. As the prisoners continued their tour of factories, mills, and shipyards, a realization crystallized. The war they had fought in Europe was only one dimension of a larger struggle, and in this arena of steel, steam, and human coordination, Germany was facing a challenge unlike any before. The awe and shock experienced here would linger, shaping perceptions, morale, and historical memory long after the war's end. The realization of America's industrial dominance continued to deepen as the German POWs moved beyond the factories and shipyards. They traveled to aircraft plants in California and Pennsylvania, where bombers, fighters, and transport planes were assembled with astonishing speed. Each fuselage, wing, and engine was produced with meticulous precision. For men who had flown against Allied aircraft over Europe, seeing the volume and quality of planes being manufactured on U.S. soil was a revelation. They could not escape the fact that each aircraft represented a tangible projection of American power, ready to reach any battlefield across the globe. In addition to aircraft, the production of armored vehicles and tanks left an equally indelible impression. In Detroit and Flint, tank hulls rolled off assembly lines as crews worked in near-perfect coordination. POWs observed the synchronization between engineers, mechanics, and assemblers, a choreography that seemed almost inhuman in its precision. German soldiers, many of whom had operated tanks themselves, were forced to confront the reality that America could replace losses far faster than Germany could on the battlefield. The disparity was clear, stark, and impossible to ignore. The human element amplified this shock. POWs noticed the confidence and morale of American workers, which contrasted sharply with the exhaustion, fear, and deprivation experienced on European battlefields. There was an unspoken understanding among the prisoners. This efficiency was not just about machinery, but about a society mobilized, united, and committed. Even during wartime, American workers maintained discipline, professionalism, and a sense of purpose that many POWs found inspiring, albeit intimidating. Letters and post-war memoirs recount vivid moments of this realization. One officer wrote of standing on a catwalk overlooking a Detroit tank assembly line. It was as though the entire world of war had shifted. Here, in steel and fire, was the true strength of the enemy. Nothing we had faced could compare. Another soldier described Liberty ships being launched in staggering numbers, row upon row of ships disappearing into the water, as if the sea itself belonged to them. How could we hope to compete? The psychological impact on German leadership within the POW camps was also significant. Officers tried to maintain morale, reminding men that they were still soldiers, that the war was not yet lost. Yet even their attempts to reassure were challenged by what the men witnessed daily. The vastness of production, combined with American organization and efficiency, introduced a new kind of intimidation, one that was structural, systemic, and almost inevitable. The POWs were no longer confronting individual soldiers on a battlefield. They were facing an entire nation capable of sustaining war indefinitely. For some prisoners, this realization sparked a quiet admiration. They marveled at the ingenuity, the skill, and the dedication of the workforce. Engineers and technicians who had once served in German industry or the military took note of production techniques, organization, and innovation, recognizing a level of efficiency far surpassing their own experiences. This acknowledgement did not diminish their status as prisoners, but it reshaped their understanding of power, strategy, and logistics. The turning point reached its apex in multi-camp tour, where POWs were transported to witness different aspects of American production. From steel mills in Pennsylvania to aircraft plants in the Midwest and naval shipyards on the East Coast, the prisoners were immersed in a world where scale, coordination, and speed were intertwined. Each site reinforced the same truth. America's industrial might was not just impressive, it was overwhelming, and it would define the war in ways that frontline battles could not. As the weeks progressed, the cumulative effect of these experiences became clear. POWs discussed, often in hushed tones, the impossibility of matching such output. Confidence in German victories waned. The notion that sheer bravery or tactical genius could overcome industrial disparity seemed increasingly implausible. By the time they returned to camp, the prisoners carried not just the memory of machines and assembly lines, but the knowledge of a systemic superiority that would shape both their captivity and their post-war reflections. This moment, the confrontation with America's industrial engine, marked the definitive turning point for the German POWs. It was an education in scale, efficiency, and national mobilization, one that forever altered their perception of the war. The shock, awe, and quiet resignation experienced here would resonate through the remainder of their captivity and beyond, shaping memories, memoirs, and historical understanding for decades to come. As 1945 approached, the war in Europe drew to a close, and German POWs in the United States faced the inevitable transition from captives to witnesses of history. By this time, tens of thousands of soldiers had been processed through camps across the country. Locations ranged from the swamplands of Florida to the plains of Kansas, and from Pennsylvania's Steel Belt to the agricultural heartland of the Midwest. Each camp had a distinct character, yet all shared the same purpose: to house, organize, and, when possible, integrate prisoners into work programs that supported the American war effort. The scale of POW labor was significant. Soldiers worked in agriculture, harvesting crops that sustained both the domestic population and overseas troops. In industrial assignments, they handled non-combat tasks, from warehouse organization to machinery maintenance. While they were not producing weapons directly, their contributions allowed the American workforce to focus on essential military production. Estimates suggest that German POW labor in the U.S. accounted for millions of man-hours, boosting agricultural yields and infrastructure projects at a time when labor shortages were acute. For the prisoners themselves, the aftermath of their industrial encounters was multifaceted. Many had entered captivity anticipating hardship and isolation. Instead, they found clean barracks, regular meals, medical care, and most strikingly, exposure to a society mobilized with staggering efficiency. Letters sent to Germany, carefully censored but full of detail, described sprawling factories, humming assembly lines, and trains that moved with unerring punctuality. Soldiers noted the contrast between this orderly environment and the chaos, destruction, and scarcity they had known on the European front. Repatriation processes began even before the official end of the war. By mid-1945, POWs were systematically screened, documented, and prepared for transport back to Germany. The logistics of repatriation mirrored those of their arrival: meticulous, coordinated, and extensive. Trains carried prisoners to coastal ports, where ships ferried them across the Atlantic, returning men to a country devastated by years of war. Yet even as they departed, the memories of American industry remained vivid. Soldiers carried with them images of assembly lines, towering cranes, and the relentless rhythm of production, a permanent imprint on their understanding of what the enemy could achieve. Beyond practical considerations, the experience reshaped perceptions. Many prisoners returned with a newfound respect, sometimes reluctant, sometimes awestruck, for the scale and organization of the United States. For those who had fought fiercely on European battlefields, it was a humbling recognition that the war was not solely about tactics, courage, or military skill, but about the capacity to mobilize an entire nation. The U.S. industrial engine had not only supplied the front lines, but had also influenced the psychological landscape of enemy forces. The POWs, first-hand observations, became informal testimony to the effectiveness of America's industrial and logistical strategies. The local communities surrounding the camps also felt the impact. Many POWs worked alongside civilians on farms, in factories, and on infrastructure projects. Their labor alleviated shortages and integrated them, in a limited but meaningful way, into American daily life. Residents who interacted with the prisoners often described mixed reactions: curiosity, cautious trust, and occasionally genuine camaraderie. In some cases, these interactions created subtle but lasting impressions, humanizing the enemy and offering Americans a window into the experiences of soldiers far from their homeland. This first phase of the aftermath set the stage for deeper reflection. While POWs would eventually return to Germany, the consequences of their exposure to America's industrial power were enduring. It influenced their personal perceptions, informed post-war narratives, and contributed to a broader understanding of how industry, logistics, and societal mobilization could shape the outcome of modern warfare. The stage was now set to examine the longer-term consequences, both psychological and historical, that extended well beyond the immediate repatriation of these soldiers. Upon returning to Germany, the POWs carried more than memories of captivity. They bore a profound awareness of the industrial and societal capacity of the United States. Soldiers who had once been confident in German superiority now confronted the reality that their nation had faced an opponent capable of producing, sustaining, and deploying vast quantities of war materiel with near unmatched efficiency. This realization influenced not only individual morale, but also the collective understanding of the war's broader dynamics. Letters, memoirs, and post-war interviews consistently reflect this impact. Many former prisoners emphasized the magnitude of what they had seen, noting that no European battlefield experience could have prepared them for the scale of American production. The work performed by POWs in the U.S. also left practical consequences. Millions of man-hours contributed to agriculture, infrastructure, and logistics, boosting output in ways that directly supported the war effort. Fields harvested by POWs fed soldiers abroad. Maintenance of machinery and support tasks in factories allowed American production to continue unimpeded. While indirect, these contributions underscored a unique paradox. Enemy soldiers had become instruments in sustaining the very war effort that had captured them. It was a subtle form of integration into the industrial heartbeat of a nation at war, and it left many POWs with a complex mixture of resentment, respect, and introspection. Psychologically, the experience was transformative. POWs returned with a heightened sense of the scale and organization necessary for modern warfare. Those who had served in logistical or engineering roles within the Wehrmacht often remarked on the systemic superiority of American practices. Letters sent home, some reaching German families after the war, described sprawling factories, continuous assembly lines, and the near-magical efficiency of American industry. These accounts slowly permeated the German consciousness, shaping post-war reflections on what had been lost and what challenges lay ahead. The long-term historical significance of the POW experience became clear in post-war narratives. Former prisoners' observations contributed to Allied and German understanding of industrial mobilization and societal organization. Engineers, military analysts, and policymakers in Germany studied these accounts to grasp the factors behind America's wartime success. The exposure to large-scale production and organizational methods influenced post-war industrial planning in both Europe and Germany itself, offering lessons in efficiency, coordination, and workforce management. Socially, the camps left subtle but enduring effects on local American communities. Civilians who had interacted with POWs often reported that the experience humanized the enemy. These encounters, working side by side in fields or assisting in infrastructure projects, challenged perceptions of faceless adversaries, replacing them with individuals navigating the complexities of war and survival. For some POWs, the experience fostered mutual respect and understanding that endured long after the war's end, forming unlikely bridges between former enemies. The cumulative effect of the POW's time in the United States, from arrival to labor, from observation to reflection, reshaped perspectives on both sides. For the prisoners, the lessons were immediate and personal. Industrial might, logistical mastery, and societal coordination could define the outcome of conflicts far more decisively than battlefield heroics alone. For Americans, the presence and conduct of the POWs highlighted both the moral and practical dimensions of humane treatment, underscoring the United States' capacity to maintain order, efficiency, and ethical standards even amid global conflict. By the time the last German prisoners were repatriated, the U.S. had demonstrated not only its capacity for war production, but also the broader implications of combining industrial strength with social organization. The POW's journey, from capture in Europe to work and observation in America, offered a unique lens on the realities of modern warfare, where victory depended as much on factories, logistics, and human coordination as on guns and strategy. Their experiences would echo through post-war reflections, shaping historical understanding for decades to come. The story of German POWs in the United States is more than a chapter in military history. It is a study of human perception, industrial power, and the hidden dimensions of modern warfare. These men, hardened by years of combat, arrived expecting confinement and hardship, yet encountered a society operating with astonishing scale, precision, and purpose. Factories that seemed to stretch endlessly, assembly lines moving with mechanical rhythm, and communities mobilized in unison revealed a dimension of war that few could anticipate, that the engine of victory often resides far from the battlefield. For the prisoners, the experience was transformative. It shattered assumptions, humbled pride, and expanded understanding. They came to realize that warfare was not merely a contest of courage or tactics, but of organization, resources, and human ingenuity applied at unprecedented scale. Each tank assembled, each aircraft launched, each field harvested was a testament to the collective effort of a nation determined to sustain itself in conflict. In witnessing this, the POWs were not passive captives, but inadvertent observers of history, learning lessons that would resonate long after the war. The American response, humane treatment, ethical labor practices, and strategic organization, reinforced the notion that victory depends not only on power, but on values, planning, and discipline. The POW's reflections highlight a dual truth, that industrial might can be a decisive weapon, and that the human spirit, when coordinated toward a common goal, can achieve feats that defy expectation. In the end, the legacy of these experiences is both technical and moral. They serve as a reminder of the scale at which modern nations must operate in times of conflict, and of the capacity of human societies to organize, innovate, and endure. For the German POWs, America's industrial prowess was a revelation, awe-inspiring, intimidating, and ultimately defining. Their encounters with this power illuminate the often overlooked realities of World War II, that wars are won not only on battlefields, but in the quiet, relentless hum of factories, the rhythm of assembly lines, and the collective effort of a nation united in purpose. And so, as the POWs returned home, carrying memories of steel, fire, and human coordination, they left with more than survival. They carried insight, a profound understanding of how industry, ingenuity, and humanity intersected to shape the course of history.